Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Europe Center. My name is Christophe Crombez, and I'm very happy to welcome you to our third seminar of the year, I believe, or fourth in the meantime already. And I'm very happy to welcome our speaker for today also. Our speaker is Gabriele Magni from Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. He's assistant professor there, and he's also director of the Global Policy Institute at LMU. He's going to talk to us today about LGBTQ rights and representation, and what's the matter on the right. And just for practical purposes, Gabriele is going to talk for 30-40 minutes, and then we're going to have a Q&A session. So you're very welcome to ask questions. If you want to ask a question, please enter them using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So you can enter them also during the talk. You don't have to wait until Gabriele is finished with his presentation. And then I will go through the questions that you have raised after the presentation. One last thing is also, I would like to point out that that we have closed captioning, so you can use that also by using the live transcript button or feature at the bottom of your screen on the bottom right. All right, Gabriele, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Christophe, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about some of my research with Andrew Reynolds, who is at Princeton. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so today I want to talk about LGBTQ rights and representation with a focus on right-wing parties and right-wing voters. And as I mentioned, this research is joint with Andrew Reynolds. By now, Europe has had an almost 50-year-long history of electing gay men to national parliament, to position of political power. It started in 1976 when the first openly gay man was elected to a national parliament anywhere in the world, and that was the Netherlands. And then in the following decade, we saw openly gay men elected to parliament in Italy. In the UK, here Chris Smith, who would also become the first openly gay minister in the Tony Blair government. We see then Bertrand Delanoë, who came out as gay in 1998, and then 3 years later was elected as mayor of Paris. As you may notice, in the beginning, it was mostly cisgender gay men, and all of these men were from center-left parties. And over time, cisgender gay men have been representing the vast majority of out LGBTQ members of parliaments in the world. Still today, they are about 75% of out LGBTQ MPs. But we see that over time, there is an increase in the number of lesbian women, and also more recently, an increase in the number of bisexual and trans members of parliament. And so we see a slow but increase in diversity. And talking about trans members of parliament, a few European countries in recent years have had openly trans women being elected to parliament or to government position. Vladimir Luxuria was the first trans MP in Europe when she took office in Italy in 2006. She was elected with the Communist Party. She was the second in the world after Georgina Brewer in New Zealand in 1999. Just last year, 2 trans women have been elected to parliament in Germany, and a couple of years ago, the first trans minister took office in Belgium. We also see greater diversity, for instance, when Leila Moran a couple of years ago came out as the first openly pansexual MP in the House of Commons. And over time, LGBTQ politicians, and mostly gay men and lesbian women, have also become heads of government. So far, we have had 5 countries in Europe where the prime minister or the head of government was openly gay and lesbian. It started in Iceland and Belgium, and then you can see Luxembourg, Ireland, and Serbia. And I think what is interesting is that the last 3, so the heads of governments in Luxembourg, in Ireland, and in Serbia, they all come from center-right parties, not from center-left parties. And indeed, we see a growing visibility of openly gay and openly lesbian members of parliament and ministers coming from right-wing parties. Here, just to get an idea of some of them, in Scandinavian countries, we have ministers who are openly gay from center-right parties. And you can see here at the top in Sweden, in Denmark, in Norway, in executive positions. And then another more recent phenomenon, which is also quite interesting, is that we see openly gay and openly lesbian politicians also when it comes to the populist far right or the populist radical right parties. Pim Fortuyn was probably the first case in the early 2000s in the Netherlands, an openly gay man for a populist nationalist party before he was assassinated in 2022. Today, we can think about the leader of Alternative for Germany, who is openly lesbian. And then we can think about some of the gay men who reach position of power in the National Front, now National Rally in France, where they have become vice president and interim leader of the party. And so we see this growing representation of LGBTQ politicians on the left and on the right. And so this is good news. We see more representation in office, more diversity. And if we take a look at the number of out LGBTQ members of parliament by party ideology, we notice that the gap between the left and the right is almost closing. Up until the early 2000s, the vast majority of LGBTQ MPs was elected with center-left parties, but then we see that the right starts picking up the pace. There is a significant increase. And then if we look at the bottom, the yellow line is the number of openly LGBTQ members that have been elected with nationalist parties, and then radical right, the black line. So we see positive news in terms of increased representation across the political spectrum. And yet, despite this, strong prejudice remains. If we take a look at recent public opinion data, here are some data from Europe and the United States. And if we take a look at the number of respondents who say are uncomfortable if their child had to marry someone of the same sex or a transgender individual, we see that the numbers are still very high. For instance, in Europe, 57%, almost 3/5 of the people would be unhappy if their child married a trans individual. And we also see that there are consistent and strong minorities in both Europe and the US that have not really embraced gay and lesbian rights. About 1/4 of the people don't believe that gays and lesbians should have the same rights as heterosexual people in Europe. And so given this, given the growing visibility on the one hand and the progress in LGBTQ rights in recent years, and then given the prejudice that remains on the other hand, these are the questions that I want to explore today. First, I want to look at how voters react to LGBTQ candidates. And as I mentioned today, I'm going to focus mostly on right-wing voters. And this is based on a paper that Andrew Reynolds and I just published in JOP. And then I want to talk about the second question, which is the project that we have just started as a follow-up project, looking at the other side of the equation. If you want the supply side, rather than focusing on voters, we're going to focus on parties. And so we're going to try to explain why and which right-wing parties support LGBTQ representation in terms of candidates and in terms of rights. I'm going to start by focusing on the first question, the attitudes of voters towards LGBTQ candidates, with a focus on right-wing voters. So in order to explore these questions, how voters react to LGBTQ candidates, we conducted a survey and a survey experiment in the US, the UK, and New Zealand. I'm focusing on US and UK for the sake of time right now. And we chose these countries because all of these countries have an electoral system with single member districts where voters are used to vote for a specific candidate rather than party list, so that our experiment would be more realistic. An interesting difference between the US and the UK is also the experience that voters have with openly LGBTQ politicians in office. There is by now a significant number of the UK, and these numbers are from 2019 because that's when we actually conducted the survey. At the time in the UK, 7% of the members of the House of Commons identify as LGBTQ. So on 45, the number was 10 in the US Congress, which is 2%. The number has gone up in the UK since then, and it's 11 in the US. Another interesting difference between the UK and the US is the different attitudes of conservative parties when it comes to LGBTQ rights and representation. So for instance, in the 2019 election, if we look at the results in the UK, there were more openly LGBTQ members of parliament elected in the Conservative Party than there were in the Labour Party. Of the 45 overall, 20 were from the Conservative Party. And so we see representation on the right. As we know, the story is quite different when it comes to the US. Not only there are no Republicans who openly identified as LGBTQ in Congress, but also at the state level, the picture is really revealing of a clear partisan divide. These are the numbers of the openly LGBTQ members of state legislatures in the US. And of the 175 members of state legislatures in the US in 2021, only 6 of them are Republicans. The vast majority are Democrats. So we have these countries where the right side of the political spectrum has really taken different positions when it comes to LGBTQ rights and representation. And in order to explore voters' attitudes towards LGBTQ candidates, we conducted online surveys with samples that mirror census quotas for key sociodemographics in order to get as close as possible to a nationally representative sample. And then we embedded conjoint experiments in our surveys in the US and the UK. Just to give you an idea of the conjoint experiment, we essentially ask our respondents to choose among pairs of candidates. We presented 5 pairs of candidates to our survey respondents, and we provided some information about the candidates that respondents were going to pick in hypothetical elections. Specifically, we randomized 8 candidate attributes. We are really interested in 2 of them, sexual orientation, so the candidates could be gay or straight, and then gender identity, they could be cisgender or transgender, and men or women, cis men or cis women or transgender. And then we provided additional information about candidates in terms of their race, their age, their religion, their education, their health condition, and their political experience. One thing to notice, we decided to keep the political party constant. And so in essence, these are primary elections where respondents are asked to choose among 2 candidates of the same party. And this is the example of a conjoint item from the UK, where we told our respondents that the party that they were considering voting for, their own party, was considering these 2 possible candidates for the House of Commons, for the district in which the respondents live. And then we asked them which of these 2 candidates would you be more likely to vote for. So here you can see a pair of candidates. The content of each cell when it comes to individual characteristics is randomly generated, and therefore it varies from candidate to candidate. And so because of this, after we collect all the data, we can estimate the marginal effect of each individual characteristics of these candidates on the likelihood that respondents choose candidate 1 or candidate 2. So in other words, we can estimate whether being gay has a positive or negative effect on the likelihood that a candidate is chosen, and so on. Just to show the results. So these are the results from the United States. Here, the plot is showing the results based on the average marginal causal effect. Just very quickly on how to read the plot, we can see that there is a vertical line, and then there are points to the left of the line and points to the right of the line. When a point is to the left of the line, it indicates a negative effect on the corresponding characteristics on the likelihood that a candidate with that characteristic is going to be selected relatively to the baseline. So for instance, if we focus on the top, which is sexual orientation, we see that there is a negative point when it comes to being gay compared to being straight. So that's a negative effect on the likelihood that a candidate is chosen when it's the candidate is gay and the other candidate is straight. And we can see negative effect for transgender candidates as well. If we try to quantify the penalty faced by these candidates, we see that in the US, gay candidates in this primary election face almost 7 percentage point penalties, and the penalty is stronger in the for transgender candidates, where it is 11 percentage points. If we look at the UK, same plot, results, looking at the penalties for gay and transgender candidates in the UK, we see that there are still penalties. The penalties for gay candidates still are important, even though they are slightly smaller than the penalties observed in the US. It's about 2 percentage points less. The penalty for transgender candidates is essentially the same in the US and the UK. And here you can see the penalties for minority candidates and women running for office. Compare in the two countries, we can see that transgender candidates face a penalty almost as large as Muslim candidates, while the other candidates that really face prejudice and strong reaction from respondents in our survey. Okay, so this is just to give an overall picture based on respondents in the overall sample. I think what is interesting is to look at party differences between voters of right-wing parties and voters of left-leaning parties in the two countries. And I think there is something interesting coming out of these results. It is true that right-wing voters tend to have more negative attitudes. So Republicans in the US, more negative attitudes than Democratic voters, conservatives in the UK than Labour voters in the UK. But I also think that it's interesting to notice that the party difference is much wider in the US than it is in the UK. It is more than 13 percentage points, the difference in the US. In the UK, it's about 4 percentage points or so. So we see party difference in both countries, but we see that right-wing voters especially penalize gay and transgender candidates in the US rather than the UK. So party difference seems to be less clear, less stark in the UK. Another point that we develop in the article, which is also interesting in relation to left and right, is the analysis of the sources of voter bias. Why is it that some voters reject gay and transgender candidates? And for this part of the analysis, I'm happy to go more into detail in the Q&A, but we still use a conjoint experiment in order to try to get at some of the social desirability effect. What we find essentially is that some voters exhibit outright prejudice. They dislike LGBTQ people. They would not want to have LGBTQ people as their neighbors. And since they don't like LGBTQ people, they're not going to vote for someone who identifies as gay or transgender. Then we find that other voters exhibit electability concerns. They're worried about a gay candidate or a trans candidate winning elections. They're worried that they're not going to be able to deliver the district for their party. And since they care about their party winning the district, they're going to pick a safer candidate. And again, electability can be linked to prejudice. I'm happy to expand on that, but they are at least theoretically separate sources of voter bias. And then the third point that comes out of the analysis is that ideological perceptions of candidates also play a role. What this means is that LGBTQ candidates tend to be seen as more progressive, and then these perceptions interact with the ideology of voters, so that liberal voters may be more likely to embrace someone perceived as more progressive, while conservative voters may be more likely to reject someone who they believe has policy positions that are quite distant from their preferences. And so if we take a look at these sources of voter bias, dividing again between left-leaning and right-wing voters, I think we see some interesting party differences. I want to focus mostly on prejudice and queuing in the US and the UK when it comes to gay candidates. First point that I would note is similarly to the party difference when it comes to vote choice, we see that there is a greater difference between left voter and right voters with regard to prejudice in the UK. Everyone exhibits some prejudice on the left and the right of the political spectrum, but we see that the partisan difference is much wider in the US than it is in the UK when we consider conservative and Labour supporters. And then the other interesting point is that the queuing mechanism is really much more pronounced in the US than it is in the UK. That is to say that voters perceive LGBTQ candidates as progressive and liberal in the US, much less so in the UK. We can see that the numbers are much smaller, and the number for left voters in the UK, so supporters of the Labour Party in the UK, is not even significant. So in the UK, gay and trans candidates are no longer seen necessarily as more progressive, as more liberal. And similar patterns can be detected if we focus on transgender candidates. When it comes to prejudice, the party difference is much wider in the US than it is in the UK. And the perceptions of trans candidates as liberal and progressive is much more pronounced in the US than it is in the UK. And so this is the project that we had looking at voters, and we were quite intrigued by the differences that we see between left and right voters, and specifically by the cross-national differences when it comes to the position of right-wing voters, because it's true that overall voters penalize LGBT candidates in the two countries, and right-wing voters are especially likely to penalize LGBT candidates. But we also find that the party difference is much less pronounced in the UK than it is in the US. And we also see that LGBT candidates are much less likely to be seen as strongly progressive in the UK than they are in the US. And keep in mind the slide that I showed before, where the Conservative Party in the UK actually elected more gay and lesbian and bi members of parliament to the House of Commons than the Labour Party. And so we wanted to further explore in a comparative way the position of right-wing parties when it comes to LGBTQ representation, to see if the Republicans in the US and conservatives in the UK are maybe outliers on the opposite side of the spectrum, or whether there is a systematic variation when it comes to right-wing parties and their attitudes towards LGBTQ representation. And so this is the follow-up project that we are working on, and so any suggestion is much more than welcome on this. So what do we know about right-wing parties and LGBTQ representation? So there is some mixed evidence, not very convincing, mostly based on stories and interviews, that the LGBTQ vote for right-wing parties is increasing in European countries. What we know, because we have data on that, is that since 1976, the year when the first openly gay man was elected to a national parliament, there have been about 150 openly LGBT members of parliament elected with right-wing parties. And what we know is that the number is actually approaching the number of LGBTQ elected from the left. In fact, 2019 was the first year where overall in the world, there were more LGBTQ members of parliament elected with right-wing parties than left-wing parties. So it's not just the UK, it's also beyond the UK. And what we know is that some right-wing parties have embraced gay rights, either convincingly or rhetorically, instrumentally. I'm going to talk more about this in the following slides. But for instance, we can think about David Cameron, the leader of the Conservative Party at the time when the UK, about 10 years ago, introduced marriage equality. And so at the time, 2012, the Democratic Party in the US was not really fully on board with marriage equality. And the Conservative Party in the UK was leading the introduction, or at least Cameron, despite some party differences. In Ireland, head of government for the past 3 years, until 2020, was an openly gay man for center-right parties. And then, as I mentioned before, we have openly lesbian and openly gay leaders also when it comes to far-right parties in Germany, in the Netherlands before, and we have the far-right joining pride parades, for instance, in Sweden, but also in other Scandinavian countries, in other Northern European countries. So on the one hand, we have this. On the other, we have examples of far-right parties that remain strongly against LGBTQ rights. Some of the most infamous examples come from Eastern Europe. We can think about Hungary and Poland, where far-right parties in recent years have been strongly against LGBTQ rights. But this phenomenon is not limited to Eastern Europe. If we take a look at far-right parties in other countries in Europe, we may notice that in Spain, Vox is really not very supportive of LGBTQ rights. In Italy, Lega, led by Matteo Salvini and Brothers of Italy, are strongly against LGBTQ rights. And just last year, they were responsible for the failure of the parliament to try to adopt hate crime legislation for LGBTQ people. And then we have parties, even in Northern European countries, in Western Europe, that are still religious parties. They still have a religious influence, and they're still not supportive of marriage equality and other LGBTQ rights. And this happens in Germany, in the Netherlands, and the US with the Republican parties, the strong religious influence. So how do we make sense of this universe on the right, where there are positions that are so different? How do we explain variation? Is there a systematic variation when it comes to LGBTQ rights and representation on the right? And what we argue, we propose a typology, and this list of parties is not comprehensive, it's just to give an idea, where we divide between generally pro-gay and lesbian representation and generally against gay and lesbian representation. As I mentioned before, it's not always genuine. Sometimes it's rhetorical and instrumental, but I'll go more into detail about that in a moment. And so what we argue is that on the one hand, we have center-right parties that have, broadly speaking, embrace gay rights, and we have the populist radical right in Northern and Western Europe that has, broadly speaking, embrace gay rights or gay representation. On the other hand, the populist radical right in Southern and Eastern Europe and the Christian right everywhere in Europe remain strongly against. And here I'm using gay rights and not LGBTQ rights because trans rights are really out of the picture for most of the right-wing parties. The T doesn't really go with the LG and B for the right in Europe. So why is this? We argue that on the one hand, the center-right has become generally pro-gay rights because of growing secularism in many countries, so that at this point, gay and lesbian inclusion is a sign of modernity of the party that is speaking to a moderate electorate for whom homophobia would not be a productive electoral strategy. And so the goal of center-right parties is to normalize same-sex relationship within traditional society. So it's not by chance that many center-right parties were behind marriage equality at some point, because the goal is really the assimilation of gays and lesbians into existing institutions, legal and social cultural institutions that were previously open only to straight couples and now can be open also to same-sex couples. And these strategies was evident in the words of David Cameron when he explained his support for marriage equality more than 10 years ago in 2011, when he famously noted that he didn't support gay marriage despite being a conservative. He supported gay marriage because he is conservative. The idea being that marriage is a traditional institution, and therefore he, as a conservative leader, wanted to open this traditional institution to gay and lesbian couples that were previously excluded from this existing institution. And so this is the center right. Then we have the radical right. As I mentioned in the previous slide, we argue that the radical right is split on gay rights, and the split depends on the way in which nativism is conceived by various radical right parties. So nativism is important in the political platform of populist radical right parties everywhere. The desire to protect the so-called national culture, whatever that means, against the supposed external threats, against the foreign values that are not necessarily coming from outside the borders. They may come from inside the country, but they're seen as alien to the native culture of the country. And so what we argue is that in the countries where gay rights are now seen as part of the native culture, the radical right is rhetorically embracing gay rights in order to protect the native culture from external threats. In countries where gay rights are seen as alien, as a foreign imposition, the radical right is strongly rejecting gay rights. And so what are the countries where gay rights may now be considered more or less part of the native culture? So just to give a visual representation, I think it's useful to look at the map of marriage equality in Europe. And we see that countries in Northern Europe and most of Western Europe have by now adopted marriage equality, including Switzerland, which adopted same-sex marriage after the map was produced. Countries in Southern Europe and countries in Eastern Europe did not adopt same-sex marriage. They sometimes have civil unions. In other cases, they don't have any recognition, and sometimes they even have constitutional bans on same-sex marriage. And so given this divide, what we argue is that the radical right in Western and Northern Europe has by now instrumentally embraced gay rights. In these countries, gay rights have been entrenched for a generation. We can think about the Netherlands, where same-sex marriage became law in 2001, 20 years ago. You can think about Scandinavian countries such as Denmark, where same-sex civil unions were introduced in the late 1980s. And so in these countries where gay rights are by now seen as part of the native culture, the radical right is instrumentally protecting gay rights to rally electoral support. So what does this mean? How is this done concretely? This is the homonationalist strategy that was described for the first time 15 years ago by Poor. So the idea is that these countries are offering rhetorical protection for gay rights against threats coming from outside. The threats are identified in Islam and Muslim immigrants who may bring Islam to the country. Islam is depicted as culturally hostile to LGBTQ people and women. And so what these parties are doing, they are strategically using rhetorical support for gays and lesbians in order to justify their anti-Islam, anti-Arab, and anti-immigrant position. They're taking those stances because they want to protect the native gays and lesbians. And so the goal of this strategy is not necessarily to win LGBTQ voters. It's to rally supporters who are worried about supposed Muslim attacks on liberal values in the countries. And in fact, if we look at the position of the radical right in Northern and Western Europe on LGBTQ rights and gay rights, it's really almost always linked to the so-called homophobic Muslim. So for instance, Marine Le Pen pledged to protect the LGBTQ community from Muslims coming to France, but she doesn't really support same-sex marriage. Or in Sweden, the far right decides to have a parade in a Muslim area despite the opposition of Stockholm Pride and LGBT activists. So we see a clear connection between the anti-Islam, anti-immigrant policy position of these parties and the rhetorical and instrumental support for gay rights. On the other hand, in countries where gay rights are not seen as part of the native culture in Eastern and Southern Europe, the radical right remains strongly opposed to gay rights. In these countries, gay rights are not seen as part of traditions and culture of the country. They're seen as foreign values. In Eastern Europe, they're seen as an imposition from the West by the radical right, not by everyone. They're seen as an imposition coming from the European Union. And so here the goal is really to liberate, to keep the virus out of the country. So we can think about the LGBTQ-free zones in Poland, where really the goal is to expel any presence, any LGBTQ presence in the country, because it's seen as alien to the culture of the country. In Southern Europe, the radical right, the populist radical right in Spain, in Italy, in Greece, has taken a strong stance against gay rights, because gay rights are seen as alien to the Catholic tradition that are still relevant in these countries, not necessarily always in terms of religious influence, but in terms of culture of these countries. And then finally, the last right group on the right, the Christian right, remains against gay rights. These are political parties for whom religious influence is still seen. We have church influence on political leaders and party members, and we have religiosity of voters. And so some of the important constituencies for these parties in terms of influence at the elite level and in terms of support of supporters at the national level, they are generally hostile towards LGBTQ rights. And so for these parties, it wouldn't pay to embrace gay rights because they may lose support from some of their core voters, and they may not find support in the religious institutions that are strongly allied with these parties. In fact, these are some results from our conjoint experiments. If we take a look at the attitudes of religious voters towards gay candidates, we see that there is a strong penalty coming from religious voters against gay candidates that doesn't come from non-religious voters. And interestingly enough, the penalty is there also in the UK, even in a country where conservative voters who identify center-right may now not penalize gay candidates as severely. The story is different for religious voters. And this helps us understand why Christian right parties even in Western and Northern Europe are still reluctant to embrace gay rights. And so just to summarize the picture on the right, what we argue is that the center-right has largely embraced gay rights as a sign of modernity with the goal of assimilating gays and lesbians and same-sex partnership into existing institutions. The populist right is split on gay rights, depending on how nativism is conceived. In Western and Northern Europe, there is rhetorical and instrumental support for gay rights in order to justify anti-Islam and anti-immigrant policies. In Eastern and Southern Europe, there is still very strong opposition coming from the populist radical right because gay rights are seen as foreign values. They're seen as alien to native culture. The Christian right, where the influence of religious leaders and voters is still important, is opposed to gay rights everywhere in Europe. One last slide to say something that I briefly mentioned before. I talk about gay rights for the second part of my presentation because the right in Europe has generally not embraced trans rights. And here, few reasons can help us understand why that's the case. But in essence, the very strong stigma and prejudice that we find in the communities and the very low visibility and familiarity of trans folks in most European countries make it so that it's not a convenient electoral strategy for the right to embrace trans rights. On the one hand, it doesn't really win points with moderates. It's more challenging to include trans folks into existing traditional institutions than it was to do with same-sex partnership the way that moderate center-right parties did. Trans rights are almost never seen as a national value in these countries, and so we don't find support from the far right. And so just to conclude on the right, the key is still out of the picture. Even the right-wing parties that have embraced gay rights in recent years still have not embraced trans rights. Okay, I'm gonna stop here.
All right, thank you very much, Gabriele, for a very nice presentation. So the Q&A session can start now. So if you have a question, please enter your questions in the Q&A box. I will start out by asking a question myself, maybe not directly related to the talk, but there are important elections coming up in Europe, in Hungary in early April, and in France as well. So I was wondering whether you could say a few words about the role that LGBT issues play in those elections, if any, and what the situation is with respect to LGBT representation in those two countries.
Yeah, so in terms of, thank you for the question, Christophe. In terms of what's the situation of representation. So in France, there hasn't been a very high number of openly gay and lesbian members elected to parliament. There has been a few in recent years, including from the right, but France is lagging on this point compared to not just the UK, but to countries in Northern Europe and in Western Europe, including Germany Germany at the last election in 2021 elected 28, I believe, LGBTQ members of parliament. So in terms of representation, both France and Hungary are not doing too well when it comes to openly LGBTQ members of parliament. In terms of the role that LGBTQ rights can play in the elections, well, in both countries, the far right, the populist far right, has a lot of presence in the campaigns and in the media, and so this makes, I think, LGBTQ rights more likely to be important elements of discussion, even if in different way. On the one hand, the National Rally, former National Front with Marine Le Pen, has adopted the homonationalist strategy, where they, since at least 2017, they have been saying that they are protecting gay men and lesbian women in France from Muslim immigrants. And so I think we're going to still see these a defense coming from Marine Le Pen and her party, and in terms of French values against attacks from outside. On the other hand, I think the situation is probably even bleaker in Hungary, where the two big far-right populist parties have really worked very hard to depict LGBTQ rights as something that doesn't belong in Hungary, and this becomes really a rally cry against the European Union, especially important for Orban, given the conflict with the European Union. So what they do, they can use their opposition to LGBTQ rights to rally their supporters against the European Union, which becomes the target, because among other things is trying to impose LGBTQ rights on Hungary, when Hungary doesn't believe in LGBTQ rights, at least in the narrative of the far-right party. So it can be, in a way, a wedge issue, the way it was maybe in the US in 2004, when the Republican Party tried to mobilize voters for their re-election of George W. Bush by putting same-sex marriage referenda on the ballot. Not so much because they care about same-sex marriage referenda, maybe, but because it was a way to mobilize voters. And so I think a similar dynamic could play out in Hungary.
And does that also affect the unity of the opposition? You mentioned two far-right parties in Hungary, and so the alliance of parties that is running against Orban also includes a party that is quite homophobic. So has that created some friction within that coalition, or have they been able to control that for the moment? Do you know anything about that?
So I'm not, I don't want to speak much about the dynamics of the opposition in Hungary, because it's not my area of expertise. I think what can happen is that when you have an opponent that is so visible and whose power has been so entrenched for more than a decade now, like Orban, I think they may be able to overcome division when it comes to LGBTQ rights after they've not been able to organize a unified coalition in opposition to Orban.
All right. Okay, I'll turn to questions from the audience now. Yona has a question about the results that you presented, and to what extent they may be driven by smaller groups of voters who are very anti-gay rights. I think you touched on that in one of your later slides when you compared religious with non-religious voters, but maybe you could say a few more things about that.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think, yeah, that's an important question. Yeah, I guess with conjoint, there's always the issue of the intensity of the position held by small groups of voters who could influence the results, the overall results. What I can say is that when we look at voters who we would not expect to be strongly against gay transgender candidates, we still see a penalty emerging. So when it comes to transgender candidates, which is the most polarizing, in the three countries that we had, US, UK, and New Zealand, everyone but the very progressive penalized transgender candidate to a significant extent. So even if we only look at Democratic voters, there is a penalty for transgender candidates in the US. If we look only at Labour supporters in the UK, there is a penalty for that. And so I think that the penalty may be more widespread than what we think. And with regard to gay and lesbian candidates, there are a few groups that are less likely to be so strongly opposed. So for instance, there is no significant penalty among Democrats, no significant penalty among the non-religious, among progressive. The penalty is much weaker among women than men. But the penalty is usually still there in many groups, including the highly educated and younger people, less than 35 in the US, still penalizing gay and lesbian candidates. And as I mentioned, there may be different reasons why voters penalize. It's not necessarily the case that it's always prejudice against minority candidates. There may be other concerns in terms of, as I mentioned before, electability, so chances of winning election, and the ideological position of candidates who may be perceived as distant from voters. But I think that the penalty is still quite there.
Okay. Then we have a question from Hakim. He's asking about different types of gay candidates, and whether you could say a bit more about what types or what kinds of candidates would be more successful. He is referring to Buttigieg here in the US, and who looks very respectable, like the ideal son-in-law or something like that. Are there such characteristics? And could we say that that in the future maybe those constraints in the sense of the sort of the type of character of the candidate, that they would become less important in the future maybe?
Yeah, well, I think this is a very important question. So I'm gonna answer a couple of ways, also referencing another project that I have with Andy Reynolds, in which we look really at Buttigieg. So a couple of reasons. I think that minority candidates within the LGBTQ communities face even bigger obstacles. So for instance, in our conjoint experiment in the US, Black gay candidates were penalized by about 3 percentage points more than white gay candidates. So in addition to the penalty that they face for being openly gay, there was an additional penalty if they were Black and gay. And I think this is only part of the equation. The penalty doesn't necessarily only come from voters. It also comes from party leaders who have been reluctant in especially in single-member district countries, in having candidates who are far from the traditional white cisgender male candidate of the past. And so the gatekeepers are risk averse in some cases, and so it makes it harder for minorities to emerge. So I think it's not a case that there was a trans candidate elected in Italy in 2006, and that was really only the second in the world. But then for more than a decade, there was no other trans candidate elected in Europe, almost. There was one in Poland, I believe, at some point. So really, really a minority. And in terms of Buttigieg, since it was mentioned in the question, so Andy and I did a big framing experiment during the Democratic primaries in 2020. We had more than 6,000 likely voters, and we presented information about Buttigieg, varying the salience of his characteristics. So in some cases, we try to accentuate his sexual orientation, talking about his relationship with his husband. And so there was a picture of Buttigieg embracing his husband and talking about like coming out. Then we had treatments in which we highlighted his military service, the fact that he was in Afghanistan, a picture wearing a military uniform, and then treatments emphasizing his religiosity and Christian faith. As a Christian man who goes to church, went to religious schools. And what we find is that basically when Buttigieg is depicted as a proud, openly gay man, he still faces a penalty, even within Democratic primaries. But when he's presented as a openly gay veteran in military uniform, the penalty goes away. And he does as well as the control group, which is Mayor Pete, a mayor from the Midwest. And so I think this speaks to the importance of respectability and how some characteristics, such as being a veteran, can mute some of the stereotypes that were often associated with gay men in terms of being effeminate or maybe not being interested in foreign policy and defense issues. And so here is military background can help. And all of this, so we even find a penalty for Buttigieg that in a way was a very, how can I say, a gay candidate who looked as heteronormative as possible, because he was, in terms of the way he presented himself, he was a committed relationship. The policy position were quite moderate compared to the average position of LGBTQ people. And so even despite that, there is a penalty for Buttigieg.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. There's a question from Esther also. She's asking about sort of the differences between the long-standing democracies in Europe and the younger democracies in Eastern Europe, and whether that doesn't explain to some extent the difference in attitude that radical right parties have toward gay issues, in addition to religion and other factors.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. And I think we really didn't expand on that point, but I think it makes sense because if we think about democracy, and if we think about the individual rights and the liberal values that come in a fully democratic society, I think that help us understand the importance that is placed on individual freedom and individual rights. And so I think that could help us shed further light on why there is this different position on the radical right when it comes to Northern and Western Europe and Southern and Eastern Europe. And I think this is a relevant point, because also if we try to figure out why is it the case that in some countries, Scandinavia and the Netherlands, gay rights are now part of the native culture, well, I think it has to do with the fact that the fact that democracy has been established for longer, and then there's been a fight for the protection of individual rights. And so they were initially embraced by center-right parties, and so they became more mainstream, and then the radical right also joined. So I think the point on stability of democratic institutions and the rights that come with democracy is an important one for sure.
All right. Then Xin is asking whether you could elaborate a little bit on the interaction between gay rights and Islamophobia in right-wing parties.
Yeah, so here the position is that many of these parties are openly anti-Islam and anti-immigrants, if you look at their position, but they need to present themselves in a way that is a bit more respectable, and they need to win also some more moderate voters if they want to grow and not continue to be marginalized. And so being openly Islamophobic doesn't necessarily help these parties. And so what they do, they find another way to justify their position against Islam or their restrictive position against immigrants, and specifically against Muslim immigrants. So what they're doing, basically, they're not saying, I'm anti-Muslim immigrants, I'm anti-Islam. They're saying, we want to protect gay rights, and Muslim immigrants who come into the country, they are homophobic. They're going to be a threat to French gay men or Dutch gay men. And so we need to keep them out of the country because we need to protect our own. And so in a way, I think they are taking this rhetorical position of protecting gay rights to justify their anti-Islam and anti-immigrant position.
All right. Yona has another question about the role of age and education also. Have you noticed any significant effects of those factors?
Yeah, so we looked at, we used marginal means when we did the subgroup analysis based on age and education, and we find the expected differences, I would say, where older people tended to be more against gay and trans candidates and compared to younger people, and also education played a role. But I would say there are two caveats. First, education is not as powerful as we may think. We don't find a huge difference between college graduates and people who didn't go to college when it comes to attitudes towards LGBTQ rights. So I don't think education is one of the more important points. When it comes to younger people, we do find that younger people are less penalizing towards gay and trans candidates. In fact, we find that in the UK and New Zealand, for people who are under 35, there is no penalty at all. In the US, there is still a penalty among younger people toward gay and especially trans candidates. Not as strong as older voters, but in the US, even people under 35 penalize gay and trans candidates.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I think we've come to the end of our presentation and Q&A session. So thank you very much, Gabriele, for a very nice talk. I'm very happy that you visited us here on campus. And even though we were not quite able to have a talk in person in our seminar room, but at least we are able to have visitors again. And we're very happy that you were one of the first ones to be back on campus. Our next talk is in 2 weeks. Then we will have Jonathan Hopkin from the London School of Economics and Political Science. He will talk about anti-system politics, and he will be on campus also. And hopefully our technology will be functioning properly then, and we will be able to have a talk in our seminar room. So thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope to see you again in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Christophe. Thank you, everyone, for the questions.